Shalom, giving all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashem Yahushai, Bashem Makakwadash. Double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone for teaching us his truth, and salutations to the sincere Akim and Aquathim to listen. May the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Raquai. I'm back in here with another quick and Lord's will, as always, an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, I kind of wanted to talk about abstaining lust and how essentially it shifts your mindset into a higher frequency, basically, and basically seeing how how women were actually more seen in the ancient times, right? I don't really have an exact title for it, but I kind of wanted to shift around with this mindset because, just, through some meditation, I thought about, how, women are strictly, seen within this society, because we're constantly bombarded by, sexual, over sexualized content, rather than actually how women were supposed to be in terms of an addition, to a household, to a man and his household, right, in the ancient times, right? So I kind of want to flow around, with this idea. And honestly, I sincerely hope that this lesson really truly is edifying, right? So I wanted to start off with this precept here, because this is what Esau has done to the condition of our men, as well as women too, actually, So let me start off here in the book of Ecclesiasticus. Just bear with me as I look for this. This is Ecclesiasticus chapter 10, verse 3. And it says, "An unwise king destroyeth his people, but through the prudence of them which are in authority, the city shall be inhabited." And I read this because Esau, what he has done is, he has done a thorough, very good job in destroying the minds of a lot of our men, as well as women too, right? Where it has perverted the mind of how, and cheapened the mind of how we're supposed to operate in terms of how we see women, right? And in the ancient times, when a woman was added, to a man's endeavor and his household, they were seen as basically a helpmeet. I want to get a bit of that in a second. They were supposed to be seen as a person or an individual that was going to benefit that man and actually help and add to his house. So basically to somebody who is profitable. But what Esau has done is he has taken away the the responsibility portion, as well as he has made it and commodified, what's it called, how would you say that, he has commodified sexual content to the point where it's cheap, it's free, and basically it's destroying the minds of the people. It's destroying households because you can't actually, bring forth life, with that with those overstimulations, with and people become essentially desensitized to that content, right? So let me get that word lust real quick. It's not the perfect title, but I sincerely hope this this topic is edifying to brothers, right? So really this lesson really is about what's the word I'm looking for, making yourself more whole, right? Yahweh Shai said, they that are whole don't need a physician, but they that are sick, right? Because ultimately, coming out of this culture, we've been taught and taught things that were very perverse. That's number one, right? Through these different idols and their gods and so on and so forth. And ultimately, we also have we've had and struggle with different essentially addictions, because when you read in Isaiah, the first chapter, it describes how the whole head is sick, right? So through our physician, Yahweh Shai is able, we're able to essentially cleanse ourselves from these different so-called addictions, right? So this is really a bit of a, what's the word I'm looking for? An exhortation and showing you the benefit of weaning yourself off of this, right? And it will change the way you operate, especially with women. I'm kind of going to lead off with that in a second. So it says here, lust, it says desire, appetite, inclination, sensuous appetite, pleasure, desire, lust, to be eager, wanton, unruly, playful, any source of pleasure or delight, appetite. It says a liking for a person, fertility. It says sinful sexual desire, degrading animal passion, right? From the Latin concupiscentia, right? So it says here basically pleasure, right? So that's pretty much the point. You kind of wanted to talk about it, and these are contrary things that that Paul actually talks about. The spirit basically lusted against the flesh, and the flesh against the spirit, right? So when you have a culture that constantly perpetuates and pushes out this over sexualized vibration, remember this is captivity, right? So Esau is the type of person, he doesn't have to actually shoot you to basically kill you, right? He can do it in very, very covert, subtle ways, and one of these subtle ways is over sexualized content, right? Where it basically starts to deep fry your brain to the point where you feel more docile, you feel very basically weakened, so let me go to Sirach. Actually, I'm gonna be jumping around in this book for, let me see, 1 second. As a matter of fact, I'll go to Baruch first and I'll come back here. Where is Baruch? Because part of it is a fight, that's true, right? But it's also understanding how your enemy fights as well, and that's one of the things that people don't understand, because they don't understand their enemy. Just bear with me 1 second, let me look for this. Okay, Baruch chapter 4. This is verse 1, and the point's in 2 here. And it says, "This is the book of the commandments of the Most High, and the law that endureth forever. All they that keep it shall come to life, but such as leave it shall die." It says, "Turn thee," verse 2, "turn thee, O Jacob, and take hold of it, and walk in the presence of the light thereof, that thou mayest be illuminated." So being understanding, being illuminated isn't a wicked thing. It's actually, it's having an understanding of who your enemy is and how he fights. And this is just one of the ways that he fights, is to dim, basically your vibration. Now, how does this, tie into, women and how women were seen in the ancient times? Because yes, there was a sexual, attraction you would have for women, right? When you read through the book, when you read through the book of Judith, for example, you would see how people saw her, and then she was very, very pleasant to the eyes, right? So, but my point is, when you wean yourself off of these these pleasures and these lust, you would start to see more of how women are actually supposed to be, right? So it gives you more discernment of, okay, and basically you're basically kind of going back to factory settings, so to speak, because going back to Adam, it said that the Lord, as a matter of fact, let me read it. and then I'll get the book of Tobit. Forgot how it's worded. This is Genesis chapter 2, verse 18. And it says, "And the Lord Yahweh Power said, It is not good that man should be alone. I will make a helpmeet for him," right? So, women were really supposed to be a helpmeet, someone who actually is contributing, to a household. She wasn't just somebody that just looked good, right? And that is part of the problem. you know Ultimately, Esau is really truly the problem, because he's really in charge, you know over this system and managing the system. But through his ways, his philosophies, he pushes a vibration where you constantly see perverse things, and you are not able to fully assess and actually discern what he's doing, because it's very, very covert, right? And you're not able to understand the actual healthy way, because he's a person that's perverse. He's not somebody who's upright. The scriptures say that the soul that's within him is not upright. So, through this understanding, and weaning yourself off of those things, you start to understand that, in the ancient times, women were actually seen in a more helpmeet, righteous women, I would say it like that. They were seen as, adding to a man's house. It was supposed to be seen as a helpmeet. They weren't just seen strictly only for pleasure. Of course, there will be some attraction, so to speak, but it wasn't strictly just about pleasure and pleasure only, right? Because that's one of the criteria, a lot of our men today strictly see that as opposed to that helpmeet portion. So let me read something real quick, and let me go to the book of Proverbs. you know um this is Proverbs chapter 31. Okay, I'll read verse 13, and I'll read a little bit here. It says, the description of a worthy woman. It says, she seeketh wool and flax, and worketh willingly with her hands, right? So she knew about materials. She probably was able to actually sew, because all these things are all part of an oikos, and an economy, a small economy. Being able to manage that particular household, right? It says here, she's like the merchant ships, and she bringeth her food from afar. She riseth also while yet it is night, and giveth meat to her household, and her portions to her maidens. She considereth a field, and buyeth it, and with the fruit of her hands she planteth a vineyard. She girdeth her loins with strength, and strengthen her arms, and she perceiveth that her merchandise is good. Her candle goeth not out by night. She layeth her hands to the spindle, and her hands holdeth the distaff. Let me actually look up what that word is, just for edification. Distaff. Okay, so basically it's a long cleft stick that holds flax for spinning. Okay, so normally, yeah, so when you have garments like, oh, hold on, it says here figurative for women's work. It says a woman, the female sex, authority, a female authority in the family. Presumably because spinning was typically done by women of all ranks, right? So it was a let's see what it looks like actually. Just for distaff and spindle. Okay, so these are two. So basically, are two complementary ancient tools used together to spin loose plant or animal fibers like wool, flax, or cotton. Okay, all right. So let's see here. Okay, so they basically worked together, and it was basically a these tools were done majority of the time by women, and it would take the fibers from animals, and like they just mentioned, the wool. The wool comes from the sheep, right? And the flax, the flax is used to make linen, right? So these were tools. So it shows here that this woman was, she was very industrious. She knew about fibers. She knew how to, basically, she was basically profitable. She was very useful to that man in that household. And that's pretty much the point I kind of wanted to touch on here because, not to make a topic too long-winded, but, you understand that, a woman is supposed to be a helpmeet to you, someone that actually is a complement rather than basically a liability, right? Because this is in the ancient times of how they were. This is how they were seen. They were not seen as, strictly just for the pleasure, right? Even though pleasure is tied to it, she had to be, very, very resourceful to that man and his household, being able to very, a usefulness, to the children, because these things are very, very important, right? The raising of children, the raising of families, what I'm saying? She probably knew how to, bake bread. I have a coworker right now. She's very well known for basically making her own bread and all these things that actually is supposed to help support and deepen and enrichen a family. All these things are basically like a lost art within the Babylonian culture, because when you think about what is pushed in this culture is really just about how to how to please, not necessarily please a man, but like it's really just about them just pleasing themselves, right? Scriptures say that she that liveth in pleasure is dead while she liveth, right? So it's already just about them just constantly living in pleasure rather than a mindset of servitude, putting yourself aside and actually being able to forward that care and that resourcefulness towards that man that shields children, so on and so forth, and dedicate to the essentially to the household, right? These things are basically a lost art within Babylon, right? Right, it's no coincidence that Babylon, when you read in Revelation 17 and 18, it's described as a whore, because a whore is really just somebody who sleeps around, right? And then when you go into the law, the priest, if a priest had a daughter and she played the whore, the judgment was fire, right? So it's no coincidence, right? Right? When you see the way that America is going, and the way that their subjects, live, especially their women, right? Because that's the ultimate judgment for Babylon the Great. It's fire through nuclear missiles. Nevertheless, though, going back to the point, I wanted to read, a quick chapter in the book of Tobit here. Let me just find it. This is Tobit chapter 8. I'll start at verse 1 and I'll read down to 6. And it says, "And when they had supped, they brought Tobias in unto her. And as he went, he remembered the words of Raphael and took the ashes of the perfume and put to the heart of the liver of the fish thereupon, and made smoke wherewith, right? So basically, the woman, Sarah, in this story, when you go back into the third chapter, she was basically being plagued by an evil spirit, right? And, Tobit, he basically gave his son Tobias righteous counsel of how to please the Lord and be basically upright. You know what I'm saying? So, so they were both basically going through their different moments of suffering, Tobit and this woman Sarah in the story. So here it says, verse 4, and after they were both shut in together, Tobias arose out of the bed and said, Sister, arise, let us pray to the Most High, Yahweh Bashmel Shai, would have pity on us. Then began Tobit to say, Blessed art thou, O power, Yahweh Bashmel Shai, for our fathers, and blessed is thy holy and thy glorious name forever. Let the heavens bless thee, and even all thy creatures. Thou madest Adam, this is verse 6, here's the point. Thou madest Adam, and gavest him Eve, his wife, for an helper to stay. Of them came mankind. Thou hast said it is not good that man should be alone, but let us make unto him an aid like unto himself. And now, O Lord, I take not this my sister for lust, but uprightly, right? Therefore mercifully ordain that we may become aged together, right? So that's really the point here. It wasn't strictly just for lust, right? It was basically, in the ancient times, when you took a woman, there was a joining together of houses. There was a forwarding of inheritance, of culture, of making sure responsibilities were both laid out, on the man's end as well as the woman's end, right? And basically, and then essentially to bring forth children, right? That is the basic, that's your first economy. That's your first, oikos, as it says in the Greek. That's your first small economy, right? And then the man, if he has the financial bandwidth, he might actually take on more wives, if he so desires, right? So the point is that the women, it wasn't strictly, only just for lust. It was to be able to, basically be fruitful and multiply, and extend that man's lineage, right? So basically, in this society, what you have is it's a destruction of the Israelite family in multiple different facets. It's not just how I spoke about earlier with over sexualized content, forget about the food and all that kind of stuff, right? But it's basically, they were not seen as just strictly just for lust only, so eventually, they ended up getting married, Tobias and Sarah, right? And I believe they also received some inheritance and so on and so forth. So that's pretty much the point I kind of wanted to hit in regards to when you essentially, it's not strictly just about lust, even though lust is a portion of it, but also understanding a woman is supposed to be a helpmeet, unto you, right? It wasn't just strictly just for basically pleasure and pleasure only, right? Ultimately in this society, you you do what you can, right? But understand that, a woman is supposed to be able to add some sort of value to you, as a man, right? So, as a matter of fact, I'll end off with this last one. This is Sirach chapter 25, verse 1, and it says, in three things, I was beautified. and stood up beautiful both before the Most High Yahweh Bashem Shai and men, the unity of brethren, the love of neighbors, and a man and his wife that agree together, right? So it shows you how important those things are actually, strongly needed within our households, right? And these are things that, our people, strongly they forget. They don't prioritize, this importance. You know what I'm saying? So, they don't prioritize really fixing the self first, right? And then that trickling down, because, to be able to do that, like I say, how Shai said, they that are whole don't need a physician, but they, that are sick, I came not to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance, right? So to be able to fix yourself is to be able also to acknowledge, you got some things that you got to work on, and then basically start to, become more whole, right? And through your maker, through your power, right? So I'll leave the lesson there, but Lord's will, this lesson was just quick and edifying. Hopefully this made sense, right? I'm trying to make a long point. But Lord's will, this is edifying, so I give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashem El Shai. Until next time, I say Shalom.